We are in a golden age of Fire Emblem, and Fire Emblem Engage is the peak game in the franchise. Now, this may sound a little hyperbolic, especially because I am no doubt being influenced by what I like to refer to as new toy syndrome, in that we often think more positively of movies, games, and TV shows after they first come out, when we haven't had as much time to sort of sit with and chew on them critically. However, I feel, after having completed and started a second playthrough of Fire Emblem Engage, that this is truly the best Fire Emblem game in the series. By a significant margin as well. I feel like if I were to put all of the Fire Emblem games into a tier list, this would be an S or S+, where the next game down, for me personally, would probably be an A or S, depending on how I ordered the tiers. Tier lists are weird. Obviously, this is subjective because the things that people enjoy in Fire Emblem games vary from person to person. For example, I've been pretty vocal about not liking the features in My Castle / Somniel / Monastery, and being more of a fan of a balanced difficulty where it doesn't seem too draining like Three Houses Maddening, but it also isn't completely easy like Three Houses Hard. I fully recognize that there are people who get joy from other aspects of these games, such as being able to socialize with their favorite character, or fully optimizing a turn, taking into account 15 different skill procs and all the other enemy skills and player skills, and lining everything up so that you survive at 1 HP with every enemy on the highest difficulty reverse mode, hacked in with all this other nonsense. And those are perfectly valid ways to play Fire Emblem. A sentiment that I feel is not only reflected by me, but also Engage. It really does feel like a game with a little bit of something for everything. Whether your favorite unit is FE1 Jagan or FE Awakening Donald. Whether your favorite game mode is to LTC or to train your entire army to 20 before using Master Seals. Whether you prefer the extreme difficulty of ROM hacks or the extreme ease of Birthright Phoenix mode. I already made a first impressions video on why I felt like if you haven't purchased Fire Emblem Engage, you should, so go ahead and check that out if you want my initial thoughts, but I feel like here I want to make a slightly more in-depth, while still being spoiler-free and or spoiler-light review-ish of the game. In this video, I'm primarily going to be focusing on the gameplay over the story. However, I do want to note that I also think the story is very good. It's definitely up there with the best Fire Emblems we've gotten, which granted is a pretty low bar, but I feel like the narrative around Engage is the story is terrible, but the gameplay is phenomenal, and I kind of want to push back against that. I am planning on making a full video in defense of Fire Emblem Engage's story, but that's for another time. Let's start out with the gameplay in a vacuum. You as the player are given a wide variety of tools. Stuff like being able to stack poison for extra damage with knives, or being able to get 80% hit percentage-based damage with backup units. You can take advantage of these tools to take on foes who wildly outclass your units, or at the very least keep up with your units, which is something that still feels like it outclasses you since you tend to be outnumbered in Fire Emblem maps. Gone are the days where you could simply send a paladin or a wyvern into the middle of a group of enemies with a hand axe and just delete all of them on enemy phase. In fact, the game is very anti-juggernauting, because the enemy has access to the same tools that you do, such as Mystical's ignoring terrain bonuses, so suddenly your dodge tank is still facing full hit from mages. Enemy groups tend to be pretty mixed. There are usually some mages thrown in with the melee units, so you can't just reliably send an Armor Knight to the front lines either. At least not without a plan for dealing with the mages first. In fact, I think the skill that is most rewarded in Fire Emblem Engage is identifying which enemies are the biggest threats and the best way to get rid of them. Oftentimes, the best way to get rid of threats is through the emblems, which makes sense because it's kind of the central gimmick of this game. You know, it's Mega Evolution for this Fire Emblem. At its simplest, this comes down to identifying a threatening enemy, clicking on your activated Engage ability like Lodestar Rush, and deleting them so you can enemy phase everyone else. However, as you get later into the game, you end up with things like, there's a group of enemies who I want to not have to deal with on enemy phase, so I'll activate Corrin's passive ability to freeze all of them. While this doesn't permanently solve the problem, it puts it off for a turn so you can deal with everyone else around you and then come back to them with more units available next turn. The order of operations in which you do things is also even more important than in previous games. In other Fire Emblems, as a general rule of thumb, the order you do things is not typically important unless you are setting up for a kill or want to try and use your least reliable unit first so that you can fix their mistakes if they miss. However, here, the ability to poison enemies for increased damage or break them to avoid a counterattack means that even if you know everyone is teaming up against the same person, who goes first actually makes a difference. Likewise, since bosses and even some generic enemies have multiple health bars, you'll want to order your attacks in such a way that you don't waste, quote-unquote, any damage. Now this is all well and good in a vacuum, however, great gameplay on terrible maps still doesn't make a very good Fire Emblem game. Just look at the non-conquest portions of Fire Emblem Fates if you want an example of this in action. Thankfully, Engage's map design is top-notch. The majority of the maps are what I would call small to medium size, which makes sense because, especially when you're unpromoted, your units are going to have lower move than the average Fire Emblem game. However, they still feel packed with things to do. Most maps have at least one side objective, like treasure chests or droppable items, and often these are very valuable. For example, they are the earliest ways that you can get utility stats like Obstruct and Trap or Rescue. Even if the reward is only money, there's always something to buy, especially if you're engaging with the donation system that I'll touch on later. For the majority of these objectives, the time limit feels perfect such that you can reasonably get to it, but you will need to be more aggressive than perhaps you would like to be. It straddles the line from being free versus impossible. Near the end of the game, I can think of one side objective that had a very tight time limit even under hard mode. However, I feel like I may have been playing suboptimally, especially because I didn't engage with all the Somniel features, and so that feels like it's more my fault than the map's. The side objectives aren't the only way this game punishes turtling, however. There's very few one-tile-wide choke points. In fact, the only ones I can think of are on maps that are throwback references to older Fire Emblem. Most maps will also have reinforcements that show up in a timely manner so that if you are not aggressively cutting down the opponent, you will end up overwhelmed. Thankfully, even on the highest difficulty, these are not ambush spawns, so they give you time to respond while simultaneously feeling threatening enough that you want to deal with them. While the objectives are not the most varied thing in the world, with the majority involving killing one or more bosses, the maps themselves do still feel very unique. This is in part because at least half of the maps are gimmick maps. Now, I feel like there's a negative connotation when it comes to the word gimmick, however, I don't think that's necessarily earned. A lot of maps in Fire Emblem are gimmick maps, and that doesn't necessarily make them bad. While it's true that Revelation's elevator map or the snow shoveling map are examples of bad gimmick maps, there are plenty of good gimmick maps in Fire Emblem as well. Take, for example, Conquest Chapter 10, often hailed as one of the best maps in Fire Emblem, in part because of its central gimmick where Takumi lowers the water after, I think it's 7 turns? Engage's gimmick maps include things such as terrain that only works for the opponent, terrain that will slow you down if you end your turn in it, or terrain that will give you extra move next turn if you end your turn in it. Finding out how to take advantage of or avoid the gimmicks just adds another dimension to the strategy of the maps. This also leads to your squad potentially rotating depending on what the map specifically calls for, because most of your units are going to be specialists rather than generalists. Despite their low move, Armor Knights are really tanky, which is something that you lack if you need to quarantine off a space for enemy facing. Cavaliers and Flyers are going to be able to move around, but for the most part tend to be weaker than your grounded units. Thieves have higher vision for the Fog of War maps, which is key because you can no longer move into the fog. Having a good number of backup units and staff users on your squad is also really valuable on almost every map, but which ones you bring and what emblems you give them might vary depending on the challenge ahead. It feels similar to Fate's Conquest, where if a unit specializes in nothing, they tend not to be very good, even if they are generally pretty good at everything. That's because of how player base heavy it is, and how having the correct tool to just shut down an enemy or group of enemies proves very, very valuable. This can become doubly true if you engage in the building system, either by inheriting emblem skills or reclassing a unit into a class that they don't start out in, that they might fit better. Some examples of this are making Kagetsu into a Wolf Knight so he gets perpetual 1-2 range, or turning any of the late join units who have 200 SP into heroes for free access to Brave Assist and Dual Strike Plus. I actually really like how this game handled reclassing. It's far from free, however, it's also not exactly necessary. While most units will benefit from the correct reclass, most units are also usable in their base class, at least to a certain extent, especially on the lower difficulties, meaning hard and normal. In fact, the game seems structured in such a way that it encourages you, at least on a first playthrough, to use every single unit. While there are viable training projects, for example, I brought Chloe and Louis, who are some of the first units to join, to the final map, it's also entirely viable just to use the pre-promotes who join in their join order. The rest of my squad was just pre-promotes. I feel like in basically reverse order of how they joined, discounting some of the ones that died. As such, it feels almost more Iron Man friendly than something like FE1. You're constantly getting replacements who either keep up with or downright outclass your training projects. That's not to say that the people who enjoy training units are going to be left out in the cold. You get units early on who will be good if you focus on them. You just can't focus on everyone. This game even includes a villager archetype, John Fire Emblem. Well, I do think he's kind of a joke unit because even if you train him up, he's going to be outclassed by some late game sages and mid-game sages. If it's the sort of thing that you enjoy doing, he does have a unique approach to the skill. Instead of doubling his own personal growth rates, his personal skill of aptitude will double class growth rates, meaning that whatever class you put him in, he's still going to do decently well as that type of unit. I'm sure that there are going to be some funny meme builds of Berserker John or something. Now, if your first game was Three Houses, or if for some other reason these side games appeal to you much more than the main gameplay of Fire Emblem, I've got good news for you. Engage has you covered there too. The Somniel has a variety of minigames, and while I'm personally not a fan of some of them, such as the rhythm-based push-up game, I do think others are genuinely fun. Squats, for example, I enjoy doing even if the benefit isn't that great on the battlefield. And the improved fishing mechanics are kind of cool to engage with, no pun intended. As I mentioned in my previous video, making all of this seem mostly optional, even on the highest difficulties, I feel like is a genuine plus. If you take advantage of it, you will be rewarded, but you don't feel like you're being punished for not doing so. Kind of the best of both worlds. In my first playthrough, I kind of mainlined the game, and so I only interacted with some of the monastery stuff. This did end up punishing me because I didn't know that the arena was a good way to inherit skills from the emblems, but I was still able to beat the game without too much trouble, so there you go. That's a perfect example of how it doesn't punish you really harshly for not engaging with the systems. And the arena one is one of the freer ones to engage with, and it's the bigger reward. I didn't even know about wyvern riding until I watched someone else's stream. That's how tuned out of the monastery I was. And yes, I will probably keep calling the Somniel the monastery. Deal with it. I do also want to say that this game feels like a textbook example of fan service done beautifully well. There are so many tiny little touches to the emblems that are referencing past games. For example, Ike getting demolished because FE9 was the first game where you could destroy doors, or Celica giving you Gaiden magic where you lose 1 HP but you get a boosted power. There's so many tiny tidbits like that. Even in the bond conversations between a certain unit and an emblem, they'll like reference something from the game. It's endlessly adorable to see all these cool things. None of them are necessary to enjoy the game, but if you are a longtime fan of the series, seeing something like Ike gets Wrath Resolve is going to bring a smile to your face, or the hammer for killing the Black Knight. or Mergles on Lin, finally, the vindication that we wanted. It's chef's kiss. This is beautiful. I love it. I love it so much. In conclusion, I would say that Fire Emblem Engage doesn't just have a little something for everyone. It has a lot of something for everyone. Regardless of your experience with the series, your level of skill, whether you prefer training projects or pre-promotes, the specific challenge runs you enjoy, or lack of challenge runs you enjoy, I feel like if you like Fire Emblem, you are going to like Fire Emblem Engage.